Hi, Shashank.
Hi, Nikhil.
I think we are good to go almost.
Okay, let's go.
So, hello everybody, and welcome to Shashank's Chai with Biscuit Talk.
Yes.
So, I think, how do we start? Let's get a chai. Let's get a biscuit.
Oh,
And
with
there we go.
chai.
Everybody, chai and biscuit, please.
Good, good, good.
So, right, Shashank, here we go. So,
Yes.
everybody knows who Shashank is. So, basically, I'm going to hand you over to a special interviewer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't want to ask questions. So,
Okay.
Just do that. One second.
So there we have our interviewer in now. Are you there, interviewer?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, Vishnu interview. Awesome. Okay. Did not know that. Okay. Good. That's a nice
Good
surprise.
evening, everybody. Thanks, Nikhil, for inviting me to do this.
Let's go.
Okay.
I've missed what's been happening until now. So since you've kept me under
You
lock
have
and
to
key,
you have to first bring your chai and your biscuit because that's what we are planning to do
that
here.
part I got. So
Yeah.
I have
No
my
worries.
chai.
I'm the only one who's like, I think I just finished my tea, so I need to get hold of one more cup. Anyway.
Yeah. So everybody should please mute their audios and videos. Everybody else. And over to you, Vishnu.
Yeah. One more clarification. Are we going to take audience questions? Will that
At
be
the
on
end,
chat?
yes.
Okay.
It'll be on chat. It'll be on chat.
Okay.
Yes.
Perfect.
All
right.
Start, Vishnu. There are some certain questions which were already sent to me, so I have made a small presentation as well in between, so we can actually take those presentation. We'll figure out how to do that. Anyway, let's start.
Yeah. All right. So let's start at the beginning, Shashank. Why don't you talk about how you got into birding and what keeps you coming back for more?
What got me into birding? So I was interested in wildlife from my childhood. Uh, it's very weird because you know most of the stories anyway. But it was my grandfather who gave me a book on Indian animals, and which had everything from mammals to certain reptiles and everything in a single book. And I think I was a 3 or 4 year old, and by the time I went to school, I had like by hearted that book completely. And I remember, in terms of birding point of view, in fact, in my third standard, one of my class teachers asked me to write. She actually gave everyone to assignment, like write an essay about your favorite animal. So some people wrote about dog and cat and everything. And I was torn. Should I write about leopard or should I write about elephant? And so I finally ended up writing an essay about elephants. And I still remember in that essay I mentioned about gestation period of elephant, and teacher was completely flipped. And it's like, yeah, that's fine. But in the same year, I remember I started keeping notes on one crow nest outside my house, and I still have that note somewhere, like, where I've written down how many eggs were laid on what date, how many days it took those eggs to hatch, and everything. And then slowly I started birding. I got one nice red. My granny rescued one red-winged bulbul, and I wanted to identify that bird. And then I got hold of one bird book, identified red-winged bulbul, and then I realized, oh, that bird is right outside my house. And then I started watching birds, and that's how I started birding.
How did your family react to this?
They were completely cool with it. They were like, fine, you do what they. As one thing at my family, you know that everyone is completely in for whatever you want to do. There's no problem. You can go ahead and take your own call, take your own decisions, and so they were perfectly fine.
Okay, so let's get into the meat of it now. What part of the bird ecology studies or birding do you actually most enjoy?
I like a couple of things about birds. I like everything about birds, but there are a couple of aspects which I love the most. One of them is biogeography of birds. So just to make trying to make everything very simple, is birds have evolved over millions of years. and there are reasons why certain birds are present and not present at the same time in certain habitats and certain locations on the planet. Like for example, there are birds which are there only in Western Ghats. There are certain birds which are there only in Andaman and Nicobar. There are certain birds which are there only in Northeast but not rest of India. There are certain birds which are there only in the dry habitat of India and not anywhere else. So why birds are there, it's and how they have come to be there is the study of biogeography. And because I like to get into birds' mind when I study something like this, so I know birds more intimately when I do something like that, and like when I study biogeography, and that's why that's one of my favorite aspects. And I would say another thing is population ecology that way, but I'm not much of a not too much of a fan of a statistics, so it's better to just have know that in theory but not uh, in back room. That's your work anyway.
That's why you married me,
Exactly.
basically.
Continue.
um, so what's your favorite bird family?
Huh. That is bit. I would say babblers overall. All kinds of like now babblers have split into multiple families, subfamilies of families actually. So I love all. So India has about 120 odd, 130 odd species of babblers, and they are like all small size birds, weak flyers, can't really disperse technically speaking. So they're a lot more localized. The populations or even subspecies, they are a lot more present in the small habitat and small geographical region as well. So that's my favorite family.
Nice. I mean, it's not something that most people immediately think of because, well, there are some specific groups of pretty
Uh,
babblers, but a
so
lot of them do tend to be brown,
just
especially in the south.
just to make sure, yeah, but just to make sure, like I'm talking about babblers in the sense like all babblers, including minlas,
Right.
fulvetas, euhinas,
Laughing thrushes.
crushes, uh, and many more. Like just true babblers as well. So
Yeah, yeah.
spotted wren
So,
babbler is no longer a babbler, but anyway,
oh, how about Myzornis?
Mazornis is in a way
Is
that
right.
no, it's
So,
one
like
of those four. Yeah.
when generally people from peninsular India think of babblers, we think of the regular
That's
brown
the reason I thought I'll just
babblers, but
explain it.
then there's such a beautiful diversity, color range, all of it with babblers. Yeah, that's I get why you like that group so much. Can you tell us a little bit about your discovery of the Himalayan forest thrush?
Uh, so discovery of Himalayan forest thrush. So basically, it was in 2009. Per Alstrom and both of us were birding in Western Arunachal Pradesh, and our idea was to record bird songs at different elevations. So we started from Eagle Nest. I'll come to some rest of the story during the talk because there are some questions which were sent to me earlier and I've made a presentation about it. But just to come to the Himalayan forest thrush part, uh, we were birding in and around Mandala and Sela Pass. If people have birded in Arunachal Pradesh, this is in westernmost Arunachal Pradesh, and we were mainly birding above 3,500 meters and above, about 4,400 meters or something like that. And what we realized as soon as while birding below, and that 2009, there was only one species of in plain back thrush. There was not multiple species when we wrote a paper about it later on, but that one species of plain back thrush was singing differently at different elevation. So above tree line during summer months, like in the month of, I think it was the month of June, the song was a lot more scratchy, and below
Krishna,
tree line,
I'm gonna stop you for a second. There are
sure.
people who are struggling to hear you, so you need to
Oh,
come closer to the mic,
it's
or
in my hand. Anyway, okay. Now, shall I
see if
increase
you
the
can
volume a
increase
little
the
bit?
volume somehow.
I think my volume is pretty much fine. Can everyone hear me right now? You can type in the chat or something. Okay. Yeah. Okay. There is yes in that. So basically, while birding there around Sela Pass and in Mandala, what we realized, the below tree line, the song of plainback thrush was lot more musical, and above tree line, the song was lot more scratchy, and that's something which was consistent on above and below tree line. So which this was something which gave us a trigger of something. Yeah, there's something wrong, and we should figure out a lot more. And I remember soon after that trip, I made another visit. Like, so basically, I left Arunachal Pradesh, reached Delhi, and from there, I remember I stayed at Atul's place for a night, and the next day morning, I went to Uttarakhand. And in Kedarnath, above tree line again, I found the same phenomena where the song was a lot more scratchier, and below tree line there was no musical song at all. There was no plain back thrush. So that's something which was very funny. And then Purr went on to other places in China where he recorded a lot more bird songs, bird calls of plainback thrushes. And then what we realized that the plainback thrushes, what we thought as one species, were not really one species. There were like multiple species involved, and I would say like there are about 4 species involved, out of which 3 of them we know because one of them was new species of science, Himalayan forest thrush, which we named after Dr. Salim Ali, and the other two, which were known populations, which were known as subspecies of plainback thrushes. One turned out to be Sichuan forest thrush, which was there in China. Other one turned out to be the now alpine thrush, which is above tree line in India. And also we know from a couple of museum specimens that there is another population of plainback thrushes, which is genetically distinct. So when we went and not only recorded songs, but went to museum specimens and collected DNA from toe pads, figured out if all those plainback thrushes are same species, different species, how many species are there. And then the fourth distinct genetic population in those museum specimens is still out there. Someone has to go and look for this new species to science. So there is a new species of science hiding somewhere in higher up in mountains of China or India, possibly I would say above tree line, but I could be wrong. But yeah, but that's in terms of where it could be, but it's definitely out there. So someone has to go and look for a new species to science anyway.
Do you think the
A lot of
Chinese
exciting things to do.
scientists are attempting, or is it
Yeah,
something?
so Purr tried it already once and he could not find it. But I'm sure there are, so it probably higher up in Sichuan maybe or something like that. Let's see. We'll know. Because the thing is, those specimens were collected in wintering ground, so we don't really know the elevation. We don't really know where they breed. So it's something which someone has to go higher up than 4,000 meters and try and find the bird when it's there singing. And then you have to also figure out those songs are consistent with the morphological characters of the birds which are then in the museums, or and also the DNA of the wild birds should match with those 2 specimens. So it's
Right.
not a small work, but it's a big job. But still, it's a very fascinating thing to do. It will be fun
Correct.
someday.
So, what do you think is the importance that regular birders pick up skills in earbirding, like using songs and calls to ID, especially given its scope in
Yeah.
species discovery?
Sorry, can you come again?
I said, what is the importance of using your ear to bird, essentially, for any average birder, given that it can lead to something like a new species discovery?
It's immense. Like I can think of at least what 4 or 5 species right now hiding in plain sight within India. And it just matter of, so see, bird songs or bird calls, you just practice. The more you hear, more you see, more you get to know about it. And it's all about listening to the bird songs again and again, going out in the field, try and, so let's say a simple trick. If I want to if I go to Northeast India for the first time and I'm not really familiar with a bird call or bird song, what I would do, I let's say if I'm birding in Mumbai, I know certain calls. I may know songs of about 30, 35, 40 species of birds. And let's say if I go to Northeast India and if I'm birding there for the very first time, the first thing I try and do is to start telling them apart by comparing them with the songs I'm familiar with. So let's say if I'm familiar with the Taylor Bird song, which is there all around us, and if we go out and if I go out to Northeast India and if I hear something which is like a Taylor Bird, because Taylor Bird is also there, but slightly lot more metallic, then then it could be a striped tit babbler.
Hmm.
So it's always about comparing the bird songs all the time, and then it just becomes a practice, just like breathing. The way we breathe, it's just like you start registering bird songs and bird calls all the time. Your brain is already processing those things all the time, so it's then it becomes much easier. And
Right.
that's the role which is very important for birding as well as ornithology, both ways.
Okay. So, switching gears now, can you
Okay.
talk about some of your favorite, like the top 5 best places in India to watch birds?
Wow, that's something which is really difficult. Of course, Eagle Nest, no doubt about that. Namdafa, again, without any doubts. Two of my favorite places on planet to bird. Eagle Nest, because I got introduced to Northeast India at that particular place, learned a lot of things. And Namdafa, because just the sheer remoteness. Umesh and I did one very long time, 2009, I guess, 8 and 9. 2008 December and 2009 Jan, we did a survey in remotest possible locations in Namdafa. And uh, just to get to the base camp, we had to walk from Miao is the last town in easternmost Arunachal Pradesh, and from there we had to walk for 7 days, one way, and same way back. And we camped there for about 50 days. Very fond memories of that place. In Nagaland, I would say easternmost Nagaland, bordering with Burma. Amazing place, amazing diversity. Again, you have to walk for a couple of days to get to the right habitat for birding. You have done that, so you know that what I'm talking about. Uh, Again, Andaman Nicobars, especially the further south you go, even it's even more exciting. A lot of things to do there. One more place. Why not Western Ghats? Again, like high elevation, Shola Forest, high level of endemism. So basically, the things which are either endemic or very remote are something which I like to do when it comes to birding.
Right. Have you become particularly attached to one of these sites, or do you just like the fact that you can visit all this diversity in different places?
Yeah, I love to visit all these sites. Like, like it's very difficult to pick favorite, but if you put gun on my head and ask me to choose a right, like the most favorite place, probably Eagle Nest.
Okay.
Yeah.
We got that settled. um, how do you think bird watching in India has changed over the last
Oh, tremendously.
30 odd years since you first began to bird?
Uh, so just to let's go step by step, like how the birding has changed in India, and that's what the way I perceived it. Uh, so the birding in India in 1990s or maybe in 80s, uh, it was like,
Frank, you're still being asked to speak louder.
oh, okay. So let's say birding in India in 1990s was. Can everyone hear me now? What
I've been able to hear you clearly all along, but I don't know, some people are struggling to
Is it
do
because
so.
of the connections there? Okay, let's see. Anyway, so birding in India has changed big time. So not just 30 odd years, but let's go before that. Dr. Salim Ali and Humayun Abdul Ali and everyone were working and during British era and everyone. So there, the main idea was to collect specimens, study them, figure out the taxonomy, and figure out how those birds were. They figure out the distributions. But now in 90s, like early 90s, uh, I still remember because I did not have there was no field guides. So there were like bird books, like Book of Indian Birds. There was pictorial guide, and those bird books were uh, I found them that time little bit inadequate to identify all birds. I used to struggle sometimes to identify some of these birds, and the only way I could identify those birds used to be to write down the descriptions, go try and open all the 10 volumes of handbook, go through the handbook what it could be, And if you are still confused and if you're still unable to identify those birds, then head to BNHS, go to museum, figure out skins to figure out what you had seen in the field. And but I would say that's something which made me a little better birder, because I was trying to notice things which were not really there in the bird books as well. And then came, I think in 1999 was the year when the first field guides, like the popular field guides, Grimmett, Inskips, Chris's book, all those bird books turned up. And then the birding changed completely, because then it was all 1300 birds were there in that one single book, where one can go and identify them. Uh, Easy to carry compared to all 10 volumes. I know some of the birders who have actually gone and carried 10 volumes of handbook in the field. So there have been cases like that. I remember even Ramana, when he went to Eagle Nest for his first time in 1995, he had carried his all 10 volumes of, because imagine I was struggling to identify those birds in Mumbai, some and around somewhere in and around Mumbai. Arunachal Pradesh must have been even more bizarre. So there were like lots of birds that time which were I thought of were mythical, but that's how you try and learn them, because there's a lot of information is there in that those 10 volumes, lot more than the actual field guides which we carry with us every day. So if anyone get chance, catch hold of those 10 books and like just go through them. It's like fun to read them. Like there are like so certain names you might find little funny, like brown lizard hawk, which is actually a Jaredon's, which one?
Baza.
Jaredon's Baza. Yeah. So there are like funny names, and bird photographers in India than bird watchers or birders, because people started investing with digital camera, because that's also happened at the same time. So digital market turned up, a lot many bird photographers and over the bird watchers or birders turned up in the field. And so the birding has changed completely compared to Western countries, let's say, but it's amazing. And just to I think someone so there's a like handbook of, so there's a 10 handbooks, it's a handbook, the 10 volumes of Dr. Salim Ali and Ripley. That's what I was talking about. Yes. And then in now the era has changed even bigger, because what was there only on photography and everything, now there is eBird. Now there's a lot of information on, so in early 2000s there used to be all these e-groups were there, the Birds of Bombay was there, BNG Birds were there, and Delhi Bird Pics, and all those things which I remember in my school days and college days sitting and reading Dharamshala Birds by Jan William Dane Beston, and I was like I used to imagine what would be to see those birds in the field, because I didn't go to those places that time. So read those emails on e-groups, and then open bird, then I have to open my bird book, see those birds, how they, what those birds used to do, and it's really like must be doing or something like that in the field, and that used to be a lot of fun.
So,
Amazing trip reports by him in early Delhi Bird.
okay. So, what, in your opinion, has it progressed for the better in the
Yes,
availability of
it is.
technology?
See, the thing is, we learned everything in a hard way, which is actually uh, there are the pros and cons for both things. So, old school birding, you learn a lot about birds that way, but because you are trying to learn everything on your own. So, the first time when I went to Eagle Nest in 2004, there was no Zenocanto, there was no eBird, there were none of these things were available. I did not have camera, so if you want to identify a bird, you have to follow the bird song or bird call till you find the bird. We used to carry tape recorder, those tapes with forward and reverse buttons to record bird songs to figure out what they are. Then they became a disc of mini disc recorders, and then they became eventually the recorders which we are using, digital recorders which are using now. And now if I want to learn about bird songs, bird calls, I just have to go on Zenocanto, learn about bird songs and bird calls before I can go to that place and then go and look for those birds. So birding has, so there's a lot of pros are there as well right now. uh, and the one thing which I still feel is because we just try and record songs and record and photograph birds, and then we come back and try and identify them. That's something which is still that's one of the ways that's one of the cons where you can't you don't not trying to learn in the field, but you're trying to learn once you come back home. That's a different way of looking at it, but I always prefer to learn hands-on in the field, which gives me more understanding about birds and habitats. So
Okay.
yeah.
Cool. So there's a recurrent theme in your conversation, which I'm sure everyone's caught on to, which is Northeast India and Eagle Nest specifically. So what has been the influence, the role of these locations and the work you've done there, and how has that influenced your life, your career, everything that you do now?
I would say everything in terms of whatever birding I've done or whatever I've done in birding is because of that. So I still remember it was during early college days, and it was I got a phone call by Ramana, and he asked me, "Do you want to go to Eagle Nest and do bird survey?" And funnily enough, it was again one of those bird, I would say, the E groups, where birds of Bombay E group, where Nitin Jamdar had seen my emails and he had seen me birding probably in and around Mumbai. And he had suggested my name to Ramana that if you are doing project in Eagle Nest, then you should ask Shashank. And that's how it started. He called me up. I was out. I was not at home. And without even asking anyone at my place, I said, yes, I'm in, because all these years going through handbook, going through all these field guides, I always wanted to go and bird in Arunachal Pradesh, because that's something with that time, it was everything was mythical. Those were the last few pages of bird books where no one had seen those birds that time in the for whatever whatever number of years. So in fact, I remember when I went there for the first time. If people have, I don't know if people, most of the audience, and they know Eagle Nest or not. So Eagle Nest, you go reach Tenga, then you reach Lama Camp, then you reach Sundarview, then Bompu, then Cessni, and so on and so forth. These are the campsites inside Eagle Nest. I reached Sundarview on the first day, and there's a landslide which happened on the first day there itself. And then for next 15 days or 20 days, I had to like walk back and forth everywhere. There were no vehicles, but that itself, because it was completely remote. There are places where 50 kilometers on either side of me, there was not a single human being while birding, and which was something which, and completely unknown place, no vehicles, but it was a lot of fun as well. So the fondness of that remoteness while birding started from Eagle Nest, and then northeast that way is amazingly biodiverse. It's that time it wasn't even explored, because I remember before I went there, only Pratap Singh, Ramana, and Anvuddin Chaudhary, only three birders who had birded inside Eagle Nest, if I remembered correct. I could be wrong, but those are only three birders who had ever birded there. So it was completely different territory, new territory in terms of bird watching and exploration and discoveries and lot many things. Not just Eagle Nest, but rest of the Northeast as well. So it was a lot of fun.
Can you
Northeast played a
describe
huge role. I did my masters also. Yes, sorry. No, no.
can you describe what the first day of birding in Eagle Nest was like for you?
First day, it's unbeatable day, because I reached Sundarview late in the night. There was a small griff camp, one small hut was there. And next day morning, me and Pratap Singh both were birding. So we got up. Pratap Singh was trying to get his recording equipment sorted. And it was drizzling a bit. So I was standing in that small door of that hut, looking out towards valley, and there's a huge tree in front of that campsite, and there's a bird which was flitting around like flying from one branch to other branch, and I wanted to say it aloud, but I did not have courage, because it was like I said, like, what if I'm wrong? So I called up Pratap Singh. I said, like, is that a ward strogon? And that was my first bird of that day inside Eagle Nest.
Wow.
So
Start with the bang.
so and yeah, and imagine till that, when I saw my first ward strogon, I hadn't been to other parts of Western Ghat when I had seen that. So for me, in the Malabar, Trogon was also a lifer that time. So I hadn't seen Red Rogan. I hadn't seen Malabar Rogan. The first Rogan I saw ever in my life was a Watts Rogan, and that's how the first day of eagleness started. First morning, first bird, first uh, day started, and that day ended with a beautiful sighting of a leopard cat. So very difficult day to beat in the field, I would say. Yeah, a lot
Yeah.
of fun.
So working in these remote landscapes for so many years, I know you have crazy stories from
Mhm.
different places, but can you tell us some of the most difficult, challenging, grueling experiences you've had?
I would say I would. This was a question which was sent to me earlier, so I have prepared a small presentation as well. And uh, in fact, like before I could get onto that presentation mode, hold on. One thing which I would like to discuss with all of you before that share screen, PowerPoint, uh, share. So this is what I've been up to in last few days, in, more or less. Can you see the screen right now?
No, we can see a black screen.
Oh, that's strange. It should be now.
No.
No, not yet.
I think ending share screen, put it back on and click the presentation that you want to share
Yeah,
specifically.
but that's what I did. One sec, hold on. Stop share.
Oh, wait, people can see it. I can't see it for some reason, but people can see
Okay,
it. Go ahead.
let me see. Share now.
Oh, yeah, now I can see it.
Okay. So this is what this is like old picture, not the lockdown picture though. You know the
We can
place.
we can see your chai now.
Yes. So that's like so this is like so while we are stuck at home without birding, this is what I'm doing right now. Like more or less, the birding is all about homework. So I'm right now going through. Actually, I'm basically birding on Google Earth. So that's what I like to do. So where I usually sit at one place, Vishnu knows the routine very well. I go on Google Earth, read about the birds which I want to see, which I want to study, try and figure out the habitats on Google Earth, try and see. Birding is all about homework. The better you prepare, so 80 to 90% of the birding is all about doing good homework. Then 10 to 15% is to get to the right place for birding, and less 5% is about luck. So when people keep saying that, oh, you're so lucky to see that bird, there is a lot of effort which goes before you can see that bird. And this is what all homework is all about. Like you have to always sit and figure out where you can see those birds, what those birds must. You have to get into birds mind before you can actually start, and you can start to go out and look for the bird. So this was a homework I was doing I think couple of years back when I went to Papua. But the process remains the same. Always just binocular and by handy, because it always helps while birding. So like for example, the right now the binocular is right here, which is not very far. So it's always helpful to watch birds around me. And right now I'm like current hobby is to figuring out the individuals how they look around my house. But anyway, individuals of certain species. So how the exact coppersmith? I think there are 4 individuals of coppersmith bobbites outside my house. So trying to identify them individually rather right now. But anyway, so uh, about those grueling stories, I would say I'm going to talk about stories which are like 3 kinds of stories. One of them is physically grueling. So this one was physically challenging story. This happened in 2012. It was in month of late March, early April, and I was doing my master's data collection in Northeast India. And I still remember because that day very vividly, because it was morning 9 o'clock. I called up Vishnu and I told her that okay, I'm heading to Anini because data collection is anyway over. I have another 4 or 5 days to spare, or maybe slightly more. So I'll just go ahead, try and see some birds in the northernmost part of DDPR. So that's Anini right over here. That's a China border up here. That's Arunachal Pradesh. And in fact, like if you guys know that this is where the Dibang Dam is gonna come up, Italin is right over here, and this entire area of all the way from here to Mauling National Park is about 5,115 square kilometer forest. Brilliant forest, like one of the last contiguous forests which is left in the country, especially in Arunachal Pradesh. And I thought, why not just let's go all the way to Anini, try and bird in that landscape. So this 225 kilometers right now, and which shows about 4 hours 48 minutes. That time in 2012 it showed about 8.5 hours. So I called up Vishnu. I told her, oh yeah, I'm heading out to Anini. I'll reach there by evening, even though I make stops for birding on the way, and I'll continue and then I'll reach Anini and give you a call. So I started my journey towards this long unwinding road. So basically, you start from Rowing. If you guys have been to Mishmi Hills, then you know there is a coffee house. You cross coffee house and go to other side. There's Hunli. So before I could reach Andini, there's a beautiful sighting. I was on the. I started a bike. I was on the bike, and just before I could reach coffee house, I saw a tragopan on the road, black tragopan, and I said like, wow, there's a black tragopan on the road, and then it was a female and a male on the road, and the female took off, and it actually dove into the valley, and the male got startled. He was flying at the same pace, literally the same pace, right next to my bike for few seconds. Then he realized the female had already jumped into the valley, and then he disappeared into the valley. So that was a kind of day which there was by then it was quite foggy, and but it's a amazing sighting. Then I continued. It started drizzling. I crossed Mayudia Pass. It started getting heavier. By the time I reached Hunli, it started pouring like it was raining cats and dogs. Couldn't see anything beyond 10, 15 feet at some time. But I continued driving on. And then there was a nice, there was also, there's one, so I was, just to make everything clear, um, there was so I was riding this TVS bike, which was 100cc motorbike. And then it wasn't powerful. And I was traveling through rain. And then there were like a couple of guys, one guy who overtook me on his Hero Honda Hulk, which is like I think some 160 or 180cc bike. He overtook me in this pouring rain, disappeared in front of me. Like, wow. And then and then I continued, and then I said like, oh, I need some powerful bike. That's what I was thinking at that moment. Then I drove on. Then I saw this guy off the bike standing and looking at something, staring at something. So went a little closer, and then I realized there's a landslide which had happened on the road. So I was wondering, okay, what to do. And he said like, no, no, it's a bike. We can just drag the bike over the landslide, and we'll continue driving. By then, his friend turned up. So three of us pulled all three bikes one by one onto the other side and continued driving. So we drove a little ahead. Uh, and then there was a small dhaba was next to the road. So he said like, you had any food? By then it was like 3:30 in the afternoon. I said like, no, not yet. So he said like, let's eat some lunch. So we went to the first place, asked them for lunch. He said like, oh, we don't have lunch, but we can give you tea. So they gave us tea. Then we drove little ahead, and we found another dhaba which had lunch. And then by the time we could finish our lunch, it was another half an hour, 45 minutes or something like that. And this guy said, oh, there are two more my friends who were supposed to travel, and they should have reached here by now, but for some reason they haven't. So I'm going to drive back and see where they are. So he disappeared. He went back towards the landslide, and then that fellow disappeared for another 45 minutes, 1 hour. And we were like wondering where this fellow went. So we waited for some time, and then it started getting dark. So we could see that okay, the bikes are coming back. So like, okay, this guy is back. But instead of three bikes, two bikes turned up. So basically, what happened? This fellow went back. He went to this landslide, and then he realized the fourth bike which was trying to cross this landslide went off the landslide along with the rider. And this rider left the bike after 40 feet. The bike disappeared into the valley. His helmet was shattered. His clothes were torn, and then he was in complete shock. So the fifth bike could cross over. They drove back to this dhaba, and I was like in two minds: should I go ahead or should I head back? I said like, if I head back to Rowing again, I may not even get chance to reach there because, like, what if there are more landslides on the other side? These guys said, no, let's go to Anini. Anyway, we will drive together and we'll continue. So we said, like, sure, that sounds good. So we started driving towards Anini. So we are like about what, 4 or 5 people and these bikers. We started driving towards this place Anini, and then crossed many landslides on that day. And then last 20 odd kilometers were left. And then one of these guys said, your bike is too slow. And this was, by the way, by then it was like 1 o'clock in the morning. They're like, your bike is too slow. It's slowing us down. What we will do, we'll drive to Anini, and we'll wait for you at Anini. And once you reach there, we'll figure out where you can stay and everything. I said, like, sure. And those guys decided to drive on. And these guys disappeared, and within 5 minutes, my bike stopped. So in the middle of the forest. I could start the bike, but bike refused to move a single inch. And by then I had it. Like, it was like, okay, it was pouring for a whole day. I soaked till my bones. And I said, like, okay, that's it. I'm not gonna do any. So I was collecting data. So I had like scalpel with me. So I tied all these my camera bag and my bag onto this bike with the help of this rubber tube. So I had no energy to even remove the knots. So what I did, I took a scalpel, chopped off that rubber tube, picked up my bags, and started walking towards Anini. I said, like, I will help with it. I've parked my bike here. I'll reach somewhere. And finally, after I must have walked a couple of kilometers, I found one house on the left. I said, like, okay, there is at least a house there. So I started knocking on the door, but I thought like there's no one in the house. So I spread out all my wet things in the veranda and decided to crash there. And it was impossible. Sleeping bag was wet. Everything was completely drenched. It was impossible to even sleep. So after I was sat there shivering for another 1.5 hours, 2 hours. And by 4 o'clock in the morning, I heard some noise inside the hut. I said, oh, there are people there. So I knocked and knocked and knocked till someone opened the door. And then the Nepali fellow was there and his wife, and they saw me and they were in shock. Like, what happened to this fellow and everything. But they were like, in Arunachal, people are really nice. That fellow lit a fire. I sat next to the fire for some time, warmed myself up, and then I went back to the bike when things got like little dry. So I went there, and then simple thing I realized that the bike's chain had come off. So after I fixed that chain with the help of one of the locals there, and I was good to go. Then I reached this Anini place after driving this last 17 kilometers, and then there more landslides happened during that other day as well. I had beautiful sighting of a wild dogs had made a kill of a sero there on the road. But that 2-3 days birding in Anini was so rewarding that within first morning, and the first bird on the morning was a black-headed greenfinch, which turned out to be a new bird for the country. And the same day evening, I got Elliott's laughing thrush, which also turned out to be a new species for the country. And imagine we are actually looking at this area of Anini, where the Dibang Dam is going to come up right over here, and right next to Vitalin. And that's where there are tigers, there are huge diversity of mammals, birds, amphibians. There are so many amphibians, probably there are yet to be discovered, described to science. And we are going to lose this if this project goes ahead. So if you guys haven't tuned in or haven't signed the petition, then I would say you guys are more than welcome to go and do that. And amazing. So that was like one of the physically exhausting, I would say, in terms of challenging birding experience. There are many, but like this one stands out, and it's like a perfect time. So this is a picture from Arunachal Pradesh, but this one is from China by James. I still haven't got picture of Elliott's laughing thrush, but I think Firoz got it in Wolong in last couple of years sometime. So there have been like a second sighting of Elliott's laughing thrush from Arunachal Pradesh. Then I would say Nicobar megapod would be one of the sightings which I would say psychologically I was like, I wanted to get that bird, and you know more than anyone else how desperately I wanted to see that bird. So just to give you an idea about, this is where India is, Sri Lanka is, that's where the Sumatra is, and that's where the Andamans and Nicobar Islands are. So Nicobar megapod is present in Central Nicobar Island groups and the Great Nicobar Island groups. They're two distinct subspecies. And what happened that we went to Great Nicobar Islands, and just to get to Great Nicobar Island itself was one of the challenging things. So Vishnu and I took a helicopter to reach Nicobar first. Then we had to walk all the way from Campbell Bay here. Like, so we took a bus all the way till this point here, somewhere here. And then we had to actually walk all along the coast, uh, somewhere around in this area. And this is where we camped. And the camp was like a makeshift camp by forest department. That's a turtle camp there. And that's what they usually, so basically we literally crashed on wooden planks, not wooden planks, actually the wooden strips. There was a kind of a mosquito net. But as soon as we reached there, we got to see Great Nicobar, which is not described to science, but it was amazing. But at the same time, throughout the night, Vishnu could not sleep because there were like, I don't know how many thousands of sandflies which were flying around and biting us through the mosquito net and everything. And it was pretty exhausting. And then we looked for megapod that day. We walked back that same area in the rain. There was a storm which came in, and it was pretty bad. At the end of it, the road was like a soup. At one place, I had to literally pull Vishnu up from one of the mudslides, small mud wall, I would say, and it was horrible.
It was quite an experience. You forget that spot where you remember there were these two rocks,
Yeah, I remember.
like spaced like 6 foot apart. The sea, the water from the sea is coming in between the rocks. And Shashank just sort of waltz over, he just jumps across. And I'm like, I can't do that. There's certainly no way I can jump across this. So he lies down between the rocks and makes a human bridge. And I had to walk over him to get to the other side.
But it was kind of quite an adventure, I would say. And then what we did, that we did not take a rest after this. This was a storm which was approaching that day, and we went back to the same area, not exactly the same area, but in the nearby areas where we went looking for Nicobar megapod nests. And then this was one guy who worked with Dr. Ravi Shankaran in 1990s, and he knew how to find Nicobar megapod mounds. And it's basically, people who don't know megapod is like they actually make this huge structure with the help of sand, dried leaves. They're usually found next to a fallen tree or at the base of this big pandanus, and they lay eggs inside this huge mound, and the eggs hatch on their own because of the temperature, which is controlled by the sand and the decaying material of leaves and branches. And the chicks are precocial. That means as soon as they come out, they find their way through this by making a tunnel through this mound, and they can take off. So the best way to find Nicobar megapod is by finding the mounds, and that's what we did. So we went to the first mound. Prem looked at it. Oh, this doesn't look like an active mound, but I know a place where I had seen them earlier. There could be another mound. So we went to another mound, climbed one hill, could not, that this mound also does not look it's active. So he said, oh, I know another place where there was a nest. Let's go and check that out. So we went to third place. There was that nest also wasn't active. And they said, oh no, there's one more nest. So I said like, okay, let's go. And by then Vishnu was fuming, but we still went to the fourth nest. Then that nest wasn't active. And by then Vishnu declared that, okay, even if the Nicobar megapod comes in front of me, I will close my eyes and I won't see the bird. I don't want to see that bird anymore. But
do me justice, at 3 a.m. that morning, we walked out saying, we're just going to go up to this nest that's like 4 kilometers away. We're going to sit down and we're going to watch the nest. That was the plan. And that's what I was mentally prepared for. And by the end of the day, we had walked 24 kilometers, sat nowhere, and saw no megapod. So I thought I was done with this species.
but yeah, so entire March trip ended without the sighting of Megapod, but I wanted to settle the score with that bird in a way. So it's all about homework and hard work and what you do before, and not just like get bird in the first attempt. So we did all the hard work was done in March 2015 to get to the same place again in December. This time I was well prepared. I took a hide with me. We found an active nest on the first day itself. Went and set up the hide in the night when it was pitch dark. I still remember Atul was very enthusiastic to go and see the bird on the first day evening. I said like, let's not do that. Let's not go towards the nest right now. Let's wait till it gets completely pitch dark. Set up a nest, hide in that when it's dark, and then let's go next day morning when it's still dark and try and see the bird. And this is what happened. Next day morning, we went and we saw Megapod, and I think when Garima was there, brilliant sightings. Like we had like this pair was active at this mount for like I think till 11 o'clock, 11:30 in the afternoon, and the hide was such a beautifully built. Because I still remember I was sitting there in that hide looking for this megapod, and megapod had gone off because at afternoon the time when the activity drops down a bit, when the megapods when the nest, and this crab eating or long-tailed macaque walked right next to me, like just 2 feet away from me, but he could not. That macaque had no idea I was sitting there because I was sitting in the hide. Went close to the nest, and then bang, the megapod came back again in the view, and it was amazing. So it was like a very satisfying. I would say this was like psychologically, this was like one of the brilliant sightings. I would say among many things, not just this, but this one comes to my mind quite nicely. And I would say the third grueling experience, I would say, is the entire Amur Falcon saga. It's not about always finding new birds or seeing lifers, but to see some certain birds again and again. This was how I saw Amur Falcons I'd seen Amur Falcons plenty of times before, but this is how I saw Amur Falcons in 2012, where they were netted, they were killed in thousands per day. They were getting cooked. They were getting like it was like a probably the most difficult thing I have done ever in my life. In terms of just to sit there near the Doyang Reservoir, getting and seeing Amur falcon slaughtered that year, but I could not do anything that year. That the only thing I did was to document the whole process. And then you know what happened after that. Thanks to Bano, Ramki, Roko, and everyone who participated in Amur Falcon campaign next year. And 2013, the same site had no hunting from 2013 onwards. It's one of the rare conservation success stories of Northeast India. And everyone worked from like government organizations to even people and the Naga Pride, which actually played a huge role in saving Amur falcons. And it was just heartening to see everyone came together to save these birds. And this is the same view, same place in 2015. So what we saw earlier was 2013, and this was 2015. I can't even count the number of Amur falcons in this photo. And this is like just before I went in 2015 to Nagaland. And but it's always an emotional grueling, even though it's a grueling experience, it was an emotional experience for me. It always gives me goosebumps. It always gives me, whenever I go and see Amur falcons in Doyang Reservoir, it actually gives me goosebumps to see that site, even though I've seen that site again and again and again for multiple number of years now. But yeah, this is, I would say, top 3 of my grueling sightings. But there are many more. I can't say name all of them anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, that was quite a story, I think, that not all of us came expecting. And so now we've realized that you do a lot of homework for every species that you go out and see. Can you tell us something about the top 5 most challenging bird sightings you've had and how you prepared and did the homework for them?
I wouldn't say not just challenging, but I would say it's like the birds, the way Atul put it, the birds which we all thought of being rare and turn out to be common, because you have to crack the bird for the first time And once that happens, then everything becomes much easier. So I would say, I'll give you an example of, for example, Horson's Frogmouth. So before I come to Horson's Frogmouth, there's a little bit of backstory. So, okay, this is a tiny town of Misamari, which is there in Assam. I'm just trying to give some context towards the map right now. That's where the Bhalukpong is. That's how you enter Arunachal Pradesh on the main road. It goes all the way like this. It reaches Tenga, and you enter Tenga from somewhere above here. And this is the road which is there inside Eagle Nest, and which comes all the way down again. It reaches Doyamara village somewhere here, and comes back and comes out near Misamari, which is again that same town, small town of Misamari, which is the army cantonment is also there. So this is how the Eagle Nest topography is. And I'll come back to Atul one more time because I remember in 2007. So this is one of the birds which I had promised him that there'll be one day when I will find this bird for you. And I was leading a tour there in Eagle Nest, and there's a British group was there with me, and I had been looking for Horson's Frogmouth for quite some time by then. It was in 2007 I looked for it, 2008 I looked for it, in beginning of 2008, and I was like, for some reason I had like procured a call of a Horson's Frogmouth also. I said like, okay, there's something wrong. I'm not doing something right in this whole process. So it was 2008 or something like that when I realized the problem was I was looking for Horson's Frogmouth with the wrong bird call. The bird call which I had was actually a great frogmouth, and there was no way I could have actually found the bird on great frogmouth's call anyway. So it took me a while to find the right call. So it was all about doing the homework correctly. This was like something with mistake which I made earlier. So it was very funny because I think birding with Yanu Shola, and he said, "Oh, you're looking for Horson's Frogmouth? Then why are you playing tape of a great frogmouth?" And it's like, "Oh, then that's the reason." They're like, "Okay, all these while I was looking for wrong call all these years, and then the moment I got a right call, it became very easy. Like in the first 2 nights, we got 7 odd individuals of Horson's Frogmouth, and I still remember I was at Lama camp. I called up Atul, and I said like, "Oh, I promised you one word." And in the very next sentence he said to me was, "Oh, you found Horson's Frogmouth. I'm coming tomorrow." I said like, "Wait. I'm leading a tour right now, and anyway you're gonna come 1 week later." He said like, "There is no way I can wait that long." So Atul made a trip in 3 days time. So this is actually I will give you this story not because it's my life, or it was Atul's life, and it was very amazing because like there's elections going on in Assam, and the whole of Assam was kind of, so if driver goes out to Assam from Arunachal Pradesh, their vehicle used to get seized and for election duties. So the driver said, "No, I can't really go on my own because the people will take away my vehicle and your friend will get stuck." I said like, "Oh, really?" So I said like, yeah, you come with me. So actually I drove all the way from Eagle Nest to Guwahati airport, picked up Atul. We drove down and we actually crossed Misamari somewhere here uh, that day. And we said, okay, let's go up and try and reach Cessni because this road was kind of open. And we were driving up this road, and we crossed this Doimara village somewhere on the border of Arunachal Pradesh and Assam. And we're driving north, and there is a small bridge which we crossed. And then there's a nasty landslide which happens every year, and every year you have to clean that, like clear up that landslide. So there's a driver called Raju who was there with us, and we were on this landslide, and this car stopped, and it refused to start, and it was pouring, and we could see the landslide was slowly coming down, and like me and Atul were out of the vehicle trying to push this vehicle back and forth, like trying to see if the vehicle is moving or not. It did not move. I don't know how many minutes or we were stuck there on that particular spot. It took us a while, and then finally the vehicle started. I said like, as soon as the vehicle started, I said, "Raju, you just cross the landslide and wait for us." He crossed the landslide. We went ahead. We went all the way up. We started looking for a frogmouth on the way up. And next day we actually found a frogmouth, daytime as well. So this is when Ramki also got to photograph frogmouth that year. This was a photograph I took later on. And now, if I think about Hodgson's frogmouth, we have found Hodgson's frogmouth everywhere, from Meghalaya to Mizoram to Manipur, Nagaland, Eastern Arunachal Pradesh. But just matter of like finding the right call, doing your homework properly and correctly, to be more precise in this particular case, and then looking for the bird. Then birding becomes much easier. Second bird, which I could say, oh, that this is something again, one of my exciting birds, which I really like to say. So before 2009, people used to go take a lot of effort to see a ghoul shortwing. So the guaranteed place where one could go and see ghoul shortwing was somewhere in Nepal, where people had to trek for 2 days to get to the right habitat and see the bird. And there were sightings from West Bengal. There were sightings. There were few sightings in wintering ground as well, but not a like confirmed sighting. You will go there and you will get to see ghoul shortwing. And I've been in Eagle Nest since 2005. By then, the first 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, like 5 years, 5 full years, and I hadn't seen ghoul shortwing till then. And I was like desperately to look for ghoul shortwing. And then this happened. So I still remember it was in last week of April. Bird to Asia was leading a group in Eagle Nest, and just below Lama Camp, James and Rob got onto Ghoul's shortwing, uh, which was in a mixed flock and looking for collared owlet or something like that. And that's left bottom is a photo clicked by Rob, and I was like, oh wow, ghoul shortwings are around, and then like okay. And funnily enough, within a week's time, me and Sachin and I were birding in Nagaland, and I was looking for Nagaran babbler, and I was watching this bird, and this Nagaran babbler goes and mobs another bird, and my binocular view, it was like Google shortwing, and I'm like wow. And this was the exact this individual was the same individual which was there, and we had like brilliant sighting. I could record a song of that bird that time, and then soon after that, this was I would say first week of May. Then poor Alstrom had come down, and when we went looking for Himalayan forest thrush, and when we were birding at different elevations higher up in mountains as well, and this was happened at Sela Pass. We were recording bird songs, and this was the exact habitat where we found ghoul shortwings. And then we saw 9 odd individuals. We saw them nesting, and then we stopped looking for them. They were everywhere. And now, if you want to see a ghoul shortwing, the best thing to do is to go to Sela Pass in the month of mid-May. By then, the ghoul shortwings are already there, established their territories. They're amazing. They actually use straws to build nests inside these crevices of these rocky crevices. And this, we saw one nest at 4,370 meters as well. So they can go really high in elevation. And now the second best thing to do is to look for ghoul shortwing is this is how the habitat is when they are not feeding in those rocky crevices, but rocky gullies, but somewhere something like this, open grassy patches. But if you want to see a ghoul shortwing now, the best thing to do is to again head to Northeast India, either in the month of May to look for above tree line, but you can also go and look for them in the last week of April in around Mishmi Hills, even Eagle Nest as well sometimes, because when they are heading up and before they can leave their wintering grounds, they start singing, and that's a time when you can actually hear them and you can find them. This is something which we had done homework about it, that me and Paul had talked about going and looking for ghoul shortwing above tree line, because there has to be a place where they must be breeding. And one of the reasons why we went there in the month of June, even in fact, like we went in last week of May and early June, the reason behind that was very simple, because we wanted to record bird songs above tree line as well. And that's how we found ghoul shortwing. It was all about doing right homework along with the right time of the year. So it's all about doing right homework and getting to the right place at the right time of the year. Another story is like spot breasted parrotbill. We had actually gone and looked for. So we have been birding this was my second visit to Nagaland, and the idea was to go and look for some of the birds which are South Assam hill birds, which are not even seen for I don't know how many years. Spot-breasted parrotbill had a couple of sightings. One from Mizoram, from Murulen. One sighting was by Pratap Singh from Eastern Arunachal Pradesh, and there were like no sightings after that. Like no one had any clue where to go and look for them. So I think on that trip there was Ramki, Sumit Sen, Vikram, and we all of them were, so we dragged them on this road beyond Benru. This was a classic habitat. So every grassy patch, I used to stop the vehicle, look for the bird. Again, and then we used to drive on, to see a suitable habitat, stop there, look for the bird. And I still remember, I think Bikram had already fed up. I was like, how many times you want to stop? So, but I kept on making sure that we used to stop at every possible habitat until the time we found a bird. So it was like a homework of a right habitat and right. So I had gone through some of the material which was there in the bird book of the right habitat for that bird, and then elevation also along with that, and then look for that particular bird in such kind of habitat. By then, spot-breasted parrotbills were almost unknown from India, and then luckily we actually found those birds there, and then I would say more than luckily we actually did a good homework, and that was the reason why we got the bird. And since then, now it has become very regular and I would say easy bird, which is thought to be rare and no longer anymore. And then it's one of my favorite stories again of two of my favorite laughing thrushes. So yellow-throated and mustached laughing thrushes were almost gone missing. So the last sighting of yellow-throated laughing thrush from India was 1929 when it was collected. And I remember Jonathan Imes had seen the bird once in Myanmar in 2000s, and that's it. There were no other sightings of that bird, and it was like a near mythical bird. And I still remember before this trip, this was 2010 May, and before this trip, I was sitting with, I was in Named Eco Camp, and Eco Camp there was on the other table James was also there, and we just sat, we had a chat. What do you think about this bird? He said like, and then we discussed a few things about where it could be. So like it should be there in Konoma somewhere. It should be in certain habitat there. But one has to go look for it. Like I'm heading to Nagaland anyway very soon. Hopefully I will try for that bird. And literally we had no idea. So Ramki and I landed. We actually finished some birding in Konoma. So for example, if you know the Nagaland, is Dimapur is right over here. That's Kohima, and Konoma is right over here in this part. And the idea was, okay, let's go to the remotest possible part of Nagaland and look for yellow-throated laughing thrush and mustached laughing thrush. So we spoke to Banu. Banu said, "Oh, don't worry, I will figure out." So, like, so which is the remotest possible place here? So like, let's go all towards Fakim Wildlife Sanctuary. Fakim Wildlife Sanctuary is right over here. So that's where the sanctuary is, and this is where the Myanmar is. So you are almost heading to the easternmost part of India's border, and the road to go there starts near Kohima, and it goes through this winding. I think probably one of the worst possible roads I would say in the country. Not the worst road, but still one of the worst roads. The road does not go straight for even 10 kilometers, like I would say 200 meters. It's always twisting or turning, or there is something or the other happening on that road. And it took us the whole day to reach from Kohima all the way to this small place called Pungro, which should be somewhere here. But anyway, Pungro is not visible right now. Oh, Pungro is here. Okay, slightly. I think it should be somewhere in this part. But anyway, so we reached to this small town of Pungro, and it took us a while. Next day, we said, okay, let's head to Fakim Wildlife Sanctuary. Brilliant habitat. So next day, we were birding in such kind of beautiful lush green habitat. Went birded for a whole day. Not a sniff of a laughing thrushes. I said like, okay, not a single, not even a yellow-throated laughing thrush, not even the mustached laughing thrush. And I said like, okay, what to do? And then I suggested Ramki. So we went back to Pungro again for a night. And I suggested Ramki that I don't think we are doing something right here. So I have a very counterintuitive strategy here. I said like, let's bird in a degraded habitat, not go to the best possible habitat in this landscape, but let's go to the worst possible habitat and look for the bird. And that's what we did the next day. We birded in a degraded habitat of pine forest. This is like undergrowth is almost opened up, some grassy patches, and there's a jhum cultivation right over here. There is a village right over here, and this is what we where we birded. And the first bird, one of the first bird we saw that morning was a mustache laughing thrush. We had an excellent sighting of that bird. This is the mustache laughing thrush on the right. And next day we got a huge flock of yellow-throated laughing thrushes as well. And now these places have like towards the eastern border of Nagaland, along the main road itself, because not only just at Pungro, but well before Pungro itself, people started getting mustache and yellow-throated laughing thrushes. But that was a moment when we actually found these birds uh, after they went missing for I don't know. So yellow-throated laughing thrush was last sighted in 1929, and if I remember correctly, the mustache laughing thrush was last reported from India was 1954. And amazingly, mustache laughing thrush and both these birds were collected by Edward Coles. The Coles is work which happened in 1950s in South Assam Mills. Brilliant guy, and he and Rupchand, both of them did amazing work, and their collections and their whatever they have done all these years have been like actually the first reference point to go and look for these birds in the wild. Laughing mustache laughing thrush from such kind of places. But till then, they were thought to be very rare birds. So it has to you have to always. I would say that way I've been fortunate enough to go and explore these areas when no one had explored them. But it always helps when you do a proper homework and get to the field.
Right. So I think we're running low on time, and we still haven't even gotten to Big Year. So on that note, can you move to telling us a little bit about how you prepare for a big year and what advice you'd give for someone who wants to do a big year?
So one thing is about that you have to figure out where you want to do big year, what exactly the areas where you want to do big year, figure out the exact habitats which are good for birding, which where you can get you lots of birds, uh, and then strategize. Strategy is the most when it comes to big year. The better you do homework. So basically, you have seen me the way I prepare for any birding trip. When I go out and bird in the areas where I have not birded before, also, or even during big year also, I try and figure out what all possible birds are there. I go on eBird. I try and see the commonest possible birds in that landscape. Try and prepare for those common birds first. Then go and so basically I divide my birds into three categories: the rare birds, the commonest possible birds, and moderate birds. And the commonest birds are the birds which where I can get them again and again. The rarest birds or the small bit of endemics, like for example, if I'm birding in eagle nest, I will put more effort to look for rufous-throated wren babbler and Sikkim wedge-billed babbler and Bugun leocicla over other birds. But let's say if I'm birding in Mishmi Hills, I would put more effort to look for wedge-billed babbler, Mishmi wren babbler, because those are the important birds there. If I'm birding in Nagaland, I will put more emphasis on the South Assam birds, which I'm not going to see anywhere else. So it's all about setting up your targets for particular region. The common birds you're going to see again and again. And what I also did in my big year was I chased the difficult birds beginning of the year as well, not just at the end. So basically, middle of the year I kept it for common birds. In fact, I looked for all my Western Ghats endemics in monsoon, in pouring rain, because I knew I will find those birds. They're not going to go anywhere. But the right time and right season, which is important for certain species, I look for them at the right places. Like for example, passage migrants, you have to be in Rajasthan, you have to be in Kutch. You cannot miss out on passage migrants because you're not going to see them again in the big year. So you have to put the priorities to certain species, so to put efforts to see some of those birds, and then common birds you can have multiple goes at common birds again and again. I would say would be the best strategy to look for these birds.
Are there birds that you tried but missed out on during your big year?
Orange bullfinch. Beginning of the year, I did everything. It was like nothing which was humanly possible, which was there in my hand, I did not do for a bird that year. So I remember there was a sighting by Pritiman in early Jan. James had a sighting on 15th Jan. I looked at the bird. It was so I was like, okay, by then the snowfall at high elevation, so the birds must have come down by then. So I went there, and that was a day when it did not snow in Srinagar, like that in and around area. It was snowing higher up in the mountains, but Srinagar was completely clean. There was no snow at all. So birds had left their breeding grounds, but they hadn't reached their wintering grounds or where they spend their winter. And then I could not like it was like I had to leave the next day. And the day when I left Srinagar, it started snowing. That exact same day. So, but I had a talk in Uttarakhand Bird Festival that year. So I could not really stay back and look for the bird that year. So I had to literally skip on it. And other two birds I would say will be a short-eared owl. I still don't know. We did everything humanly possible, and this is where you do your homework properly, do everything, and you get to the right place, right habitat, but there is a chance. So birding is unpredictable. Another bird would be white-breasted wood swallow. I have seen that bird so many times, but for that year, even though I've been to Andamans twice that year, for some reason I missed out on that, dipped on that bird. So yeah, these I would say these three would be my big misses on that big year. But yeah.
Yeah. Can you switch off your screen sharing so people can actually see you fully now that we're
Okay.
talking about
Hold on.
your big year?
Okay. Yeah. Here you go.
I wanted to ask you if you had no budget constraints, no
I know who
family
asked this question.
constraints, no career constraints, you could go do what you want
This is your
on
question.
any scale. What's your next hypothetical big year going to look like?
So there is no big year. There is no future big year. Actually, I had prepared a slide for this, but anyway.
Hmm.
So actually, why not? I will. Sorry, guys. I will share the screen one more time with you guys, and then because this is something which is so the slide should be the. Uh, this is the slide which I prepared for your question. Because I knew this was your question anyway. So another big year, of course, I don't want to do big year. But if I get chance to do big year, I would love it. Like, love to do big year in Indonesia. Again, the same reason. Lots of unexplored areas. And when you look at Indonesia, which starts from Sumatra right over here, goes to West Papua. But biogeographically speaking, for me, the West Papua ends somewhere near Sulawesi and here from this part westwards. And it's amazing because there are so many. So basically, there are lots of endemics. I would say 60% of the birds in Indonesia are endemic. And then there are birds are there which are endemic to these small island chains over here. Birds which are there in the big islands. And then amazingly, there's a biogeography which plays a role here. When you go from mainland of Indonesia towards the small islands, like let's say when you hop from Kalimantan to Indonesia or the Sulawesi part, the sea depth, can you see this slightly deeper over here? And that has caused a different, so the species diversity changes completely over here. And is something which is something very fascinating. Lots of rare birds, lots of undescribed birds. So a lot more challenging in terms of birding there. So if I get a chance to do big year, it will be like island hopping, literally. But
When
fine.
the hypothetical budget comes in, you can plan it.
Out of syllabus anyway, Vishnu. You know that. Anyway, continue.
So I wanted to ask you which birds that you think currently are thought to be extra limited for India, do you think could soon be added to the future India's bird list?
I would just soon or something like someone has to take effort to go to some remote parts of Arunachal Pradesh. I'm sure those birds, there are certain birds, like for example, long-tailed rosefinch or something like uh, three-banded rosefinch or something like that. So all those rosefinches, there are lots of palearctic birds which are there in this area, which shares the Indian border. uh, we got about 7-8 new birds overall for the country in the last few years, like especially resident birds as well, not just migratory. But
Mhm.
that's something which is like 5 birds I can think of only from Wolong. So there are lots of these hypothetical birds which are showing up. I'm sure there will be some birds which will be shared between dry habitats of Myanmar and Manipur towards Moreh and other areas of border there. So yeah,
How about high elevation of Sikkim? I know you've spoken about that with the Tibetan border.
Tibetan border. Yes, I would someday. I think there will be like I'm sure this the after the split of a magpie, the magpie would be there. The Eurasian magpie split. So there will be that magpie somewhere in Arunachal Pradesh. I'm sure about that. There are multiple species. I think I made a list of some 25, 30 odd species, wintering as well as resident, which should be there, and I need to dig out that list sometime. But that's something which one can do on sitting at home right now when you're locked down. Go through such kind of birds, try and figure out where you can see those birds, and try where you can go and bird for those birds. Right time, birding on Google Earth in thing.
Yeah. That's, I think, a habit peculiar to bird watchers. Like I've seen so many of you just going on Google Earth view and then trying to make a 3-dimensional watching habitats from aerially trying to see if you can. But well, barring our attempt at Tatekad Lake, what do you think is the possibility of finding pink-headed duck and Himalayan quail in
I
India?
think if the Udbhavana was there online, I saw some time back. But anyway, that's a fast one I pulled on one of my classmates when I had actually told her that we are gonna go, and so she said like which bird we are gonna see in uh, today in Tattegad, and I said like we are gonna look for pink-headed duck, and poor girl, she actually looked for pink-headed duck for a whole hour. But anyway, jokes aside, uh, I don't know much about mountain quail because I haven't really birded in the Western Himalayas that much, and especially the habitat where mountain quail is supposed to be. So I may not be the right person to comment on it. But
Himalayan quail is.
Himalayan quail, yeah, Himalayan quail.
Hmm.
Or
Okay.
it's a mountain quail or Himalayan quail is a
It's a synonymous.
old name, old book and new book. That's what happens with me all the time.
Okay.
So yeah, so basically, I would say I won't know much about. I can't guess much about that bird because I haven't really seen the Sherkaranda and that landscape, and haven't really birded in that landscape. But pink-headed duck, the problem is the tall grasslands of Brahmaputra floodplains or even Tarai floodplains are disappearing so fast. It will be more and more difficult. Like if I remember it correctly, the old bird books say that it used to be very easy to see pink-headed ducks, and it's been so many years and no one has seen them. That looks it's more and more
Unlikely.
unlikely, I would say.
Unfortunate. Somebody wants to know what about Jordan's Corso? I know you have an answer, so I thought I'll put it out there.
Okay. So last year I went to Jordan's Corsair habitat. Uh, there are multiple things about Jordan's Corsair. So for example, some of the habitat are completely gone now. So if you look at the Sri Lanka Maleshwara sanctuary, only the eastern part of the sanctuary has the actual right habitat for the bird. And then there are multiple challenges within the sanctuary as well. There are certain people are not going and looking for them in the night when they should be because of the like the national park. You can't really enter in the dark after dark. That's a problem. Another problem is you can't really go and look for. So basically, there are certain camera traps which are set up, but camera that as there are tigers in that area, the camera traps are set at the wrong height, so it will never capture a Jordan's Corsair. Uh, no one really has heard the bird since 2008 or 2009 onwards. So that's something which is worrisome. But someone has to really go dedicatedly spend some time there. uh, last time when I was there, thanks to Jagan, I could spend only 1 hour after dark there, which is completely insufficient. Like, for example, when the Jordan's Corsair was rediscovered in '87, people used to put in effort of about 1 hour and used to see the bird. The same thing changed to 2 to 3 hours around 1990s, late 1990s. It became even longer in early 2000s, and now we stopped seeing the bird for some time now. And then because of the canal, there are certain areas which are overgrazed because where the cattle can cross in, those areas are completely overgrazed, and certain areas where they really like they are overgrown. That's something which is like a problem. Also, the problem is there is also management issue as well, which I saw lots of areas where trenches were dug for water harvesting. The bird does not need water. It's a dry habitat bird which does not need water, and you are actually destroying the habitat by actually modifying it for no gain.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So there are lots of challenges for Jordan scores. I'm being blunt here, but that's what I saw in the field,
Right.
which was a little disheartening.
How
But
about
I'm sure there might be some small habitat here and there where bird could be there. Yeah,
Mm,
it's a nocturnal bird, so it's a secretive anyway.
yeah. How about Manipur bush quail?
I never really tried for that bird. There are two subspecies, one from in and around Manas and one from South Assam Hills.
Mm-hmm.
Someone should go and put in some lot of effort to look for that bird.
But do you think it's
It could be. It could be there. It's
possibility?
possible. It's possible. I would say.
Okay.
I haven't seen any photos or any. There have been like there are lots of claims of that bird, but I would love to see a photo someday, and I
Mm-hmm.
would love to see that bird sometime.
Okay.
So it's like all about like for me, it's all about seeing the resident populations of birds
Mm-hmm.
in the country, which actually gives me a lot of satisfaction because then you know your birds or rather than ticking all birds for me, that gives me more satisfaction to see a resident birds.
Right. Talking about such rare species, I would like to wrap up with asking you about what your conservation philosophy and what your outlook for India's bird conservation is.
It's bird conservation in India is that way not really taken off at all. Like for example, we are struggling to say even our iconic Great Indian Bustard, but more than that, it's all about not only about the rare birds. It's all about making sure our common birds remain common, and that's something which I believe in. So if tomorrow, if a red-winged bulbul, if we make sure that the population of red-winged bulbul also does not crash, or even if we make sure that at least by monitoring, we know the patterns of species, which species or which kind of species are uh, crashing. Like one of the main thing which we will face for sure in future is the climate change effect on birds, which are already happening. Umesh's study in Eagleness has shown, like I asked 9 years of his data has shown that the birds are climbing up in elevation, which as a birder I could see. At the same time, his data clearly shows the birds are losing body masses at certain elevations, and there will be population crashes in future, which are bound to happen. So we have to figure out all these things in consideration, and I would say 40, 50 years down the line, it does not look that good. When the common so yeah.
Yeah. And it's not even something that protected areas can fix, right? Like
No.
protected areas provide
Birds can move
habitat.
up and down, but habitats cannot move up. That's
Exactly.
something which is
You
the biggest
can't create
challenge
new sanctuaries at newer elevations or
in
latitudes.
that shorter time span. That's the big problem, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that was a great chat. It was fun to rehear some of the old stories that I haven't heard in a while. But I think we can move to having some audience questions now.
Sure.
Kavi, we received any questions, Kavi?
Uh, yeah, there was one on about someone having recorded. Just 1 second. Yeah, so this person's saying that he's recorded around calls of about 435 species, and he has red-vented bulbul calls from 12 states. All the songs are on eBird, can something like this be useful for research?
Of course, it will be. It's like, see, the local variation in birds are always very important. And in fact, as a wildlife biologist, these are even the songs of common birds can actually play a crucial role by for speciation point of view when the splits. So the commonest possible bird songs can also be very helpful, where we can actually figure out how many species or what those species are, where those species are, how different they sound like. So for splits while studying new species, that's something which really matters a lot. So it's a excellent idea, excellent data source as well.
Following up, there's another question on splits. So Umesh is asking that, is there any resource where we can get comprehensive information on the recent species splits?
So the best way I would say is so there are multiple taxonomies people follow. So I really never, so even though I use bird books, I don't really follow the taxonomy which is there in the bird book. I use taxonomy which is either IOC taxonomy or it's a eBird taxonomy, because those are a lot more universal in terms of the entire world species which are there on that one platform, and all of them are recognized depending on the locations or depending on the countries. So not like individual countries, but at the entire world put together. So whenever every year they have updates, so let's say IOC updates their list, I think once or twice in a year. And once they update their list, you can actually compare them with your old list. Then you can realize, okay, so I always keep one IOC list with me, which I update every year. And every year I keep on updating that list. And then I figure out the splits from how many changes have happened. And then I go on to Google Scholar, find these papers online, read those papers. That way I actually keep in. And then of course I do a lot of similar work as well. So I'm in touch with a lot of biologists who are working on these kind of species as well. So I do come to know about those splits as like that's another way. But I think the best thing to do is to compare at the end of year, if you just go through your previous IOC list with the new IOC list, you know the changes, and then you know how many splits are there.
Great. I think let's just take the last couple of questions that have just come in. So the first one is that, has the number of bird species increased after saving and protecting the Amur falcon in Doyang?
So number of species, like
number of bird species. Yeah, I think
species.
other species. Yeah.
So has it conferred overall conservation benefit?
So I would say it's a mixed effort, I would say, because see, the Amur falcon conservation is very helpful because see, it's a success story because of one of the main reasons can also contribute to birds biology itself, because the bird is a passage migrant. It's there only for 1.5 months, so you put in a lot of effort for that particular year or those particular months, and you can see the results. But for other species, what we did, we actually had eco clubs, and we could not have eco clubs for all kids in the village. But what we could see was the kids who were there in the eco club and they were regular attendants, their family members had stopped hunting, they reduced hunting, and we could see those kind of effects. So I would say that no one has like completely stopped hunting in that Doyang landscape for other species, but we could see a drop with at least certain populations of the village. So I won't say that the conservation help, Amur falcon conservation helped for all species in the landscape. No, it did not.
Right. Okay. Maybe just let's keep this as the last question. So Ronit is asking that, speaking of extralimitral species, that could possibly turn up in India, what are your thoughts on giant laughing thrush in Arunachal?
That's something which happened during big year as well. There's one time when I saw a couple of laughing thrushes high above, like I would say, tree line, and I could not. They were definitely not spotted laughing thrush or any other, but I could not get a recording, or I could not even get. In fact, I gave the direction to a friend of mine in 2016. He went there, he got the birds on respond, but he did not really see them or photograph them. So it's out there, I'm sure. So it's one of the birds. Someone has to just go and see it. It's just matter of time. Someone will go and find spotted laughing thrush in India. The giant laughing thrush in India. which looks exactly like almost like a spotted laughing thrush. But yeah, northern Arunachal Pradesh.
Nick, do you want to take a couple more questions, or should we wrap up now?
Yeah, sure. You should take it.
Okay. So
Like
there
for
is a-
example, I'll give you one example of how. So I'm sure one of these days the mangrove blue flycatcher may also turn up in Nicobars. So on my last visit, I actually dragged everyone to go and look for this mangrove patch, look for mangrove flycatcher, and we actually got stuck in uh, knee deep or maybe thigh deep muck in a saltwater crocodile infested creek. But fun days in the field. But that's how you have to keep trying for such kind of birds till they turn up. So you were asking a question. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So there's a question from Sanjay asking that why do you think the bird density is very low in many northeastern states? All these places have rich diversity of habitats, are rich in number of species, but overall the density is lower compared to other parts of India.
I don't think so. The densities are low, because see the really the data which we have is the data which is collected by Umesh in terms of densities of birds. Like whatever data he has collected, his data is showing the strong patterns of understory birds. And see, the things may change depending on place. Of course, within microhabitat, the things may change. Like the place where next to the forest, open areas, there's a lot of undergrowth. So it all changes depending on the forest types. If the forest is old forest against the logged forest, Umesh's PhD thesis is perfect example of this, where he has actually shown how previously logged forest, the densities are not doesn't matter in both places, but what matters is the body weight and the number of individuals which are getting replaced in these habitats. So the areas which are logged, heavily logged, are the places where the lifespan of these birds are much smaller, like much lesser compared to the old forest. And that those kind of patterns which are there. So I won't say the densities are low as such in such kind of places. The place birds might be very shy because of the hunting pressure. That does not mean the bird densities are low. So it might be difficult to detect them by as a birder. So as a birder, we may perceive that the birds are less in numbers, but that may not be the case at all. Or it could be the case in certain places where there's a massive hunting where things are just wiped out before they can start breeding again. Those are also cases in certain places, but I would say it's all about in a good habitat. I would say the birds they will be there, and depends on the season as well, because they move up and down in elevation as well. So there is a one more thing which we should consider as the elevational migration between the bird species in Northeast India. In the breeding season, the birds climb up in elevation. In wintering season, they come down. Or in terms of frugivores, wherever the trees are fruiting, they move up and down in elevation depending on where they are. So that also could be one of the reasons.
Yep. Thanks, Shashank. I think that was all for the questions that we had. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Shashank. It was great to hear all your fascinating adventures and very enlightening talk. And great chai. I've had 3 chais and 9 biscuits so far. And thank you, Vishnu. I know you're on Eastern Standard Time and you have to wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning to be on the stock. And thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, Nico.
Thanks, Nick.
Yeah.
And for everybody else, tomorrow, please join in the same time. We're doing a very nice talk on the life of the insects by Hayat. And you can join on the same link as today. So tomorrow, 5 o'clock. And see you guys. See you, everybody.
See you guys. Bye.
Bye.